Okay, question. Is there a reason why so much of what's shot today is still on film, like actual celluloid? 8, 16, 35 millimeter, and beyond, it used to be all we had. But despite the more efficient digital options available, visual creators worldwide still choose that beautifully gritty and grainy analog aesthetic. In today's episode, I chat with European cinematographer Luke Harper, who shoots almost exclusively on film.
I don't view the world in a glossy, shiny, sharp way where everything's beautiful and everything's perfect. Film allows you to tap into something that feels a lot more intimate. It feels like you're almost there. Some people have this idea of right and wrong within film, like if something is overexposed, it's wrong, or if something is underexposed, it's wrong. For me, there's no right or wrong. So much of film is subjective.
We break down one of the most viral music videos of this recent era, with some exclusive, unreleased behind-the-scenes footage from the shoot.
I own an Aaton XTR. It's beautifully ergonomically made. The guy that designed it obviously designed it based on having a cat on his shoulder. They're probably one of the most comfortable cameras to have on your shoulder. I'd argue it's probably the most comfortable 16mm camera. It wasn't a super huge budget video. It was intense. It was going in way more blind than I would have liked to have gone in. I only had, 24 hours, essentially one working day to get all my crew, all my kit, everything in place.
Hey everyone, Dylan here. We've been listening to your feedback and truly appreciate just how well received this series has been. We've got a big 2025 planned when it comes to this podcast. So do me a favor, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Now let's jump in. Luke Harper, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
I know that you have a real love for shooting on film, and I want to get to the bottom of why. I mean, in some ways, it's technically a worse image, right? It can be less sharp, grainy, truly imperfect. And I realized that back in the day, that's all they had to work with. But why do you think we choose it today, like when we don't have to?
Shooting on film gives like a timeless feeling. Like my most recent work that I dropped with Daniel Caesar, I shot it on 35mm over 3 years ago. And even then, I've only just dropped it. It only just got released recently. And the fact that it can hold up to my other work all those years later, I think is testament to that format. There's something for me about the grain structure, about the fact that, like you said, it is imperfect. I don't view the world in a glossy, shiny, sharp way where everything's beautiful and everything's perfect. Like for me, I look for those imperfections and I look for those sort of, those subtleties of things in our peripheral. And I think, the fact that film allows you to tap into something that's, it feels a lot more intimate. It feels like you're almost there.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think people have an appetite for it as a whole. People seem to really love it.
Yeah, I think film has come in waves. I think shooting on analog has sort of had moments where it's been super popular and moments where it's what they consider dying out. There was a big resurgence, I think, maybe around 2010, 2011. I think for years, productions, directors, DPs were shooting 35, shooting 65, and they were trying to make it look as clean as possible. They were trying to scan at high resolution, trying to clean the negs, basically trying to make it look like digital. And I know that once the Arri Alexa dropped and some of the latest models of Red, I know that they abandoned film. A lot of the DPs, maybe bar people like Robert Richardson or people that directors that still like to shoot that format. But I know someone like Deakins, pretty much abandoned film the moment he got his hands on an Alexa. So for a long time, productions have tried to clean the image, make it as digital and as sharp as possible. But I guess for those that maybe, wasn't shooting around the time when film was popular back in the sort of 90s, I was born in the 90s, so I wasn't probably shooting in the sort of golden age of 16mm and 35mm. So for me to be able to tap in to that sort of era via that format, especially with the tools we have now, the fact that you actually have the ability to view it on a monitor, the fact that you're able to watch some form of playback in terms of performance, The fact that the video taps now are HD, rather than black and white standard definition, or even not having the luxury of a monitor, and almost having to rely on the eyepiece, and only a handful of people would get to look through that. So obviously it's not right for every project. If I do a lot of visual effects, or if I know there's going to be a lot of visual effects in a project, or if I'm having to, if I know there's going to be a drone shot or an action cam shot, then typically they're quite hard to get, on 16mm and 35, because the cameras are obviously, quite heavy and quite big for the most part. But then there's things you can do nowadays like film printing, which you can send a digital file essentially to a lab and have it projected onto an egg, have it developed as if it was shot on film. And you can do things called film printing, which allows you to almost replicate a film stock, which I've done before solely for a project, and I've also done when cutting alongside stuff I have shot on film. So it's it's really come a long way.
Yeah, it's funny that even when it's shot digital, we're still chasing the aesthetic in an authentic way. That's pretty interesting. I mean, and speaking of like the technical limitations that film offers, are you ever having to like pitch or sell the powers that be to take the risk of film?
Yeah, sometimes I do have to sell it. Other times it's easier than others. I think it all depends on the track record and portfolio of a particular director. Straight after COVID, I bought a 16mm camera, and I think like any DOP that owns kit, it's quite easy to be pigeonholed into let's get him because he has this kit, which is a reason why I don't advertise that I own any kit. You would never find anything anywhere. Not on my website, not on my Instagram. There are DPs that say, I own X, Y, and Z. But for me, I never wanted to be hired based on the kit I owned. I was probably shooting 3 or 4 projects on film a month. And it got to a point where, near enough everything, to the point where my agency even turned around to me and said, maybe you should shoot something digital soon. But yeah, you're right. It's not right for every project. There are occasions where I've had to fight for it more, knowing that it is the best thing for the shoot, or it's what I think is the right appropriate format. And then there's other times where a whole director's portfolio is on film, and they've been hired for their aesthetic. And I think, it makes things a lot easier in that regard.
I mean, while we're talking about shooting on film, I want to take a moment and break down this music video that you shot for Artemas earlier this year.
I like the way you kiss me. I like the way you I like the way you kiss me. I can tell you miss me. I can tell it this.
Beautiful piece. I mean, you mentioned an insane turnaround time for this one. Why? Whose idea was that?
Well, ideally, I think most of us, it feels obvious that, the more lead time you have into a project, the nicer it is, not only for production, but also for DOPs. The more you can plan, the more info you can get in advance, obviously is a much nicer place to be in. But with this one, it was more the demands of the label and the artist. They had a song that they wanted to release. Obviously, I Like the Way You Kiss Me ended up doing amazingly on, TikTok and social media platforms. It became a huge song.
Yeah.
So I think they realized that they quickly need to get a video and sort of get it out there. The director essentially hit me up on a Thursday night. He sent me the song. I obviously had heard it. I didn't know what the song track was called, but obviously, it was really familiar. Essentially, we had 48 hours. We were shooting on the Sunday. It came in on the Thursday night, which essentially meant I only had, 24 hours, essentially one working day to get all my crew, all my kit, everything in place. I didn't have the luxury of a recce, so Lucas had to do the recce on his own, send me photos. We had to basically just base everything off of photos. None of my team got to see the location either. And it was a 48-hour turnaround, or maybe just over. It was all shot on 16mm. I think we had something like 6 rolls. It was intense. It was going in way more blind than I, would have liked to have gone in. But there was, sometimes this is the case. You don't always have the luxury of loads of prep time. And the video actually came out the Thursday after. So within a week of
Wow.
with me getting offered the shoot to shooting it on film, to going to the lab, getting developed, then scanned, then edited by the director, who also edits most of his own work. To then getting graded and sitting in the grade for it. And then it came out, that night, I think, that we graded it. So yeah, very, very fast turnaround, but really, really good fun. And great to be a part of.
Yeah, especially it being shot on film. It's pretty insane that that was the plan in order to, I think it's a testament to technology and how we've been able to dial in this process. I want to go through some quick rapid fire details on this.
Cool.
Location, real or studio?
Yeah, it was all real. So it was a really interesting location whereby I think the guy has preserved much of the building since the 70s, I believe,
Cool.
or 80s.
Yeah.
So it was all location.
What about time of day?
It was a full day on a Sunday, but I would say 90% of the music video was daytime.
How many shoot hours?
I don't believe we went into overtime, so I would assume a standard day, which is around 11 hours. It might have been a little bit longer.
What about crew?
Crew size was fairly normal. It wasn't huge. We didn't have the luxury of a huge budget, and obviously, especially because we shot on a weekend and the fast turnaround, it was obviously harder to get a larger crew size for that reason. So typically, I would have had a couple of ACs, a gaffer, maybe 2 to 3 sparks. And apart from some handheld stuff, most of the stuff in the scene you're showing, the sort of party scene, if you like, was all handheld.
What film stock, camera body, lenses, what tools did you use to get this aesthetic?
I own an Aaton XTR. Essentially, it's a Super 16 camera. It's beautifully ergonomically made. The guy that designed it obviously designed it based on having a cat on his shoulder.
I heard about this. I've actually been on set with this camera before. My first time on set ever was with this Aaton camera.
And you'll know. Yeah, you'll know from experience, they're probably one of the most comfortable cameras to have on your shoulder. I'd argue it's probably the most comfortable 16mm camera. I sort of had it. It sort of sat on my coffee table for about 3 or 4 months where I wasn't able to use it. And in that time, I fully modded it. I had everything from modernizing it to V-Lock batteries, to HD video tap with monitors, to everything, making it PL mount. I own also what they call the Hurt Locker zooms. Barry Ackroyd, who shot Hurt Locker, shot it on, I think it was 3 Aaton cameras, as far as I'm aware. And he had these zoom lenses that kind of got coined the Hurt Locker lenses. So they're Canon zooms. One of them's an 8-64, and the other one's an 11-165. They're both around T2.4, which is really fast for a zoom. That's a fixed aperture as well through the whole focal range. If I had maybe a bit more time and a bit more time to light, I knew that I'd have to probably work quite quickly, but I probably would have shot on 200T for something slightly cleaner in terms of grain structure. But we actually shot the whole video on 500T, and Above Ground, or AG, basically loves, film when it's at its sort of most dirty, its most grainy sort of structure. Where halation is super brown, super orange around lights. He loves film for everything that epitomizes film. So yeah, there's no holding back in terms of making it clean, I think, when I work with him.
It's easy to look back on it now and be able to pick it apart and know what you ended up with. But in terms of before you guys had it, what were some of your references? What was the plan? How would you describe what you guys are going for?
Has a really interesting aesthetic to his work. He's from Lithuania originally, so a lot of the characters that he casts are Eastern European. A lot of the aesthetic is Eastern European, from the locations he chooses to the characters, the styling, even the props. A lot of the videos you watch from his body of work don't necessarily feel like they're shot in England, or I would say for the most part, you might not even be able to guess where they're shot.
What about the color palette? It's so saturated, so primary. What lights did you use for this?
It's strange as well, because typically when I shoot film, I prefer to shoot on traditional lights. I prefer, old HMIs and mole beams and tungsten stuff. Usually because I feel like the quality is just way stronger. It feels like I can render skin tones nicer, softer, and it just feel like film really likes traditional sort of lights. But as you know, LEDs are much cooler. They're faster to sort of maybe get the quality of light, whereby you don't always have the time. So this was kind of a mixture. We had tungsten sources, but then we also had a lot of LEDs. There was a lot of practicals as well.
Yeah, so I mean, talking about that saturation, how did you guys really achieve that? Is it really just the lights and the color of those lights, or did you guys like boost it in the grade somehow?
For me, it's getting about 80% of the way there. Knowing that, you know, the way I light is quite different. A lot of DPs like to use a light meter, and that is something that I used at the start of my career when I was shooting on film. I was almost terrified of shooting on film. You know, I was worried it was going to be too under, too over. If the
Yeah.
sun went behind a cloud, I was like, shit, I need to get another meter reading. About 2 years ago, I started taking a slightly different approach. So on set now, every time I shoot film, I have a stills camera with me. And I find using a stills camera alongside a film camera, for me, is the single kind of best tool to give me the closest render of what that image is going to look like.
I like the way you kiss me. I can tell you miss me. I can tell it this. Not trying to be romantic.
There's some really cool moments in here where there's like this photo integration, where it's flashing photos. Where did that come from? Who took those?
So the director himself took those. I've had that in videos before. Essentially, he's very, very hands-on when it comes to the videos. Every time I shoot on my Aaton, I would say 9 times out of 10, he has his Bolex sort of next to me on a different focal length. He'll be shooting some close-ups, or he'll be shooting, you know, he obviously has a keen eye for framing and for storytelling. He also, you know, really knows what he wants. So I make sure that he sets his camera settings to what I have set up on the A cam. We make sure we're at different focal lengths. I make sure that the lighting is still favoring the angle that he wants to shoot from, because typically I only normally like shooting single camera. I always feel like, unless you're covering action where maybe you don't have the luxury of repeating something, you know, verbatim, I think it's, for me, I love lighting and shooting to a single camera.
I mean, what's that like? You know, I imagine some DPs might feel a little encroached on when it comes to the director wanting to have a lot of control over the visuals. What's it like on set on the day when you have a director who really wants to, like, literally shoot next to you?
I mean, I'm never really against it. For me, I've always seen some people have this idea of right and wrong within film. Like if something is overexposed, it's wrong, or if something is underexposed, it's wrong. For me, like, there's no right or wrong. So much of film is subjective.
What about in-camera effects? Did you shoot any off-speed or slow shutter takes?
So yeah, a lot of the time when I'm shooting on film, I love playing around with frame rates. I love the use of shutter angle and playing around with shutter speeds. On film cameras, you can't adjust the shutter that much. It's not as wide spectrum as you can on digital cameras. So a lot of the time we rely on changing the frame rate to adjust the shutter. And then essentially you would reconform that footage afterwards. So typically my sort of go-to frame rate is around 6 frames. It means that obviously it's 4 times essentially sped up when you get that footage back. But then when you reconform it, when you essentially reinterpret that footage and say, no, we shot this at 6, but it's intended for 24 frames, it plays back at normal speed, but then you get this sort of like ghost-like shutter sort of speed.
Yeah, it definitely does. I've done my share of it digitally. That step printing, slow shutter aesthetic is very popular right now. I mean, there seems to be not a single commercial music video that doesn't employ that kind of that technique, it seems, right now.
Yeah, it's a super popular technique. It's something that, yeah, people use a lot. It's funny because I actually make a point of trying not to do it on every project, because it is something that can be overdone. So I think it's picking the right moments. If I was shooting a commercial on 16mm, I might not necessarily use that technique. But I'd say for music videos, or maybe there's, you know, commercials for sort of cooler brands that maybe you get away with that sort of technique.
Can we just talk about the shininess of the skin on our characters here? Whose call was that?
One thing that I love to do, and one thing that I think film picks up really well, is skin tones when they've been sort of greased up, whether it's
Yeah.
Vaseline or baby oil or something like that. So it's a really nice effect. It really sort of picks out the light. It sort of reflects, the sort of colors around the room. It adds a sense of sweatiness. And for this particular video, where we want it to feel like these girls and everyone at this party sort of has been dancing for hours.
Yeah, the scorpion was a cool ad. What was it like working with that? Did you guys have like a bug person?
Yeah, so we had a scorpion wrangler.
Nice.
Weirdly
Nice.
enough, there's only one that I'm aware of, and I've actually worked with him twice. This was actually the second time I'd worked with him. My body of work has actually had some really, really interesting animals that I've worked with over the years, from tigers to ostriches to scorpions. I've worked with a lot of random animals, and scorpions is a funny one, because obviously, unlike a cat or a dog, they don't necessarily listen to what you want to do. So it's a lot of patience, especially shooting on film. For me, it's knowing when to roll the camera, when not to roll the camera.
Yeah, and I mean the decision to put it on a mirrored surface, I think, is really cool. It seems to like really extend the world underneath of it. I think that was a really smart choice. I want to talk about our primary dancing scene here, where all of our characters are in the same room. What was the energy like while shooting this? How did you guys go about it?
Yeah, so the energy in this room was super interesting. The music was pretty hardcore, as far as I'm aware. It was, I think some of the times we might not have even been playing the song. It might have been something that was a bit more probably house or I don't want to say trancey, but in that direction. But yeah, it was kind of what it kind of looks to be. It was very hot. It was very sweaty. We had a haze machine and a lot of lights. All the windows were obviously closed because we were shooting during the day, so it was as hot as you can imagine that to be. Especially because it was at
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know I think it was the start of the summer or maybe just a bit before. So it was very very warm in the room. But I think when everyone saw the sort of characters in the particular styling and even the use of props, even bringing that motorbike in the room and some of the other random objects that we had sort of in the room, I think when you're around that sort of stuff, when you're around these sort of Eastern European cast, this particular styling, I think um, there is a vibe in the room, there's an energy in the room. And I think everyone was so familiar with the song, everyone loved the song. It was a real vibe. I think everyone, threw everything into it. Um, no one on screen, I think, in any project I've done with Above Ground, ever looks uncomfortable or unconfident. I think the cast that he chooses are always, super unique, but super confident, take direction really well. Um, and I think that's a big part of a lot of the project's success, is the people that we had in it.
Yeah. By the way, this guy here dancing, that's me at any party, for sure.
That kind of energy rubs off on everyone else in the room, no one is sort of sitting still once they see this guy, absolutely going for it at 200 miles per hour. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, just testament to the characters, the personalities that he deploys in these music videos is amazing.
So crucial, so crucial. And I
Yeah,
imagine, yeah, in an environment like this, everyone influences each other, and someone
exactly.
jumps up to 200 and everyone else, can't be sitting at 50 if someone else is at 200.
Exactly. Like I said, no one felt uncomfortable. Sometimes, it's often that you shoot a party scene and as much as, extras are there and they know why they're there, sometimes they can look incredibly awkward. And acting subtly is almost harder than acting, and performing lines.
I love it. This scene here, can you break it down for me? Just in terms of the lighting.
Yeah, so obviously the light was going on us a little bit. I wanted to keep that sort of cold aesthetic. It wasn't the sort of video where it was like warm beauty light. It never really felt like that. It felt like sort of more a bluey greeny hue that the daylight should sort of encompass. Obviously, a lot of that is to do with the grade when it comes to that daylight coming through the doors. I did have some lights coming through the window, some lights to the right of screen. Typically, I like to make the foreground of my shots as dark as possible. So I would say first and foremost, the way I light is by killing all of the foreground light. From practicals to overhead, I try to make it as dark in front of camera as possible. So typically everything is either overhead, backlit, side lit. It's very rarely that I'll have a camera in the a light in the foreground.
Yeah.
And yeah, this was obviously a scene essentially where a guy is chatting up a girl. I think Lucas gave him some sort of direction where she's almost out of your league. It's almost that thing where you're at a party, you know, a girl might be on her phone, someone super drunk goes up to her and is obviously trying to flirt with her and, you know, probably doesn't have any chance. But the funny thing is, you know, they're just sort of talking in your ear and she's just like, you know, I've heard it all before, like, I'm not interested kind of thing. But I think with this, he actually took it one step further and almost was like, do you know what, eventually let's have a scene where, you know, you did end up hanging out. And obviously, yeah, to the point where she jumps on him and licks his helmet. So yeah, again, it just adds to the uniqueness. He doesn't ever have what I call sort of your typical model. That doesn't mean they're not, you know, beautiful people in his films, but I would say they're always unique. They're not, you know, what I would typically see in a H&M or an ASOS commercial. You know, they would more likely be in something a lot more edgy, which is cool, which makes my job, you know, way more fun. Getting to like these interesting faces and hairstyles and body shapes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of my biggest questions is what light did you have busting through that window? Or was that just the sunlight?
So I think because we opted for more LED on this, I from memory, I would say it was probably something like a Nanlux, or actually, I don't think the Aperture Evoke was out then. I would say typically it was most likely to be a Nanlux, something that was a harder LED source. We were running on 13 amp, which I'm not sure what the equivalent is in America, but typical mains power supply. We didn't have a big generator or access to anything that was 32 amp. So that's something that we had to bear in mind, was that, you know, we were limited to how much power we can draw in each room, on each circuit. So LED obviously draw very rarely any, you know, wattage.
Right.
So I think from the most part, we had a Nanlux coming through the window, keeping it super soft, and obviously not hard, so you can't actually see the source of light on the window itself. Like I said, we put a lot of neg in the foreground to create that sort of darkness. If you look at the sort of waist down, if you look at the sort of walls, everything sort of is quite dark and it sort of builds up.
Yeah, I was gonna mention I've seen a lot of people even literally just take sheets of Duvetine and paste them to the walls behind camera. Did you guys do that here?
Yeah, I mean we essentially most of the time I will have at least, depending on the location size, I'll either have sort of 2 8x8 black textiles, or I'll have 12 bys or 20 bys. It really depends how much space you have in the location. But typically that's kind of my starting point, is starting with the lights I can't control, which could have been the window. Obviously it was ground floor, so I did have the luxury of accessing that window. And essentially that would be my starting point. And then, yeah, putting the neg in the foreground, getting it as dark as I want, getting the shadows as dark as I need them to be. I'm sort of a sucker for rich blacks within an image. I like my blacks to be super sharp and super crispy.
I can see that.
I don't like them to be too milky. Typically when you shoot on film, you realize that you don't have to use as much negative blacks because it's already quite contrasty. You're already having to somewhat, I want to say, overlight an image. And what I mean by that is, you know, you're working to a much lower ISO. You know, when you're typically shooting on, say, an Arri Alexa, your base rate is 800, whereas when you're shooting on film, the highest stock rating is 500. You know, when I've shot on Ektachrome before, you're lighting for 100 ISO, which is a hell of a lot of light.
You need a lot of light for that.
A
Yeah.
hell of a lot of light. So when you're looking with your eyes, it almost feels like you're on holiday on a sunny beach, right? Because everything looks too bright, everyone looks overexposed. But when
Yeah.
you're looking at it through a camera, or as I, like to expose on a digital stills camera, um, that's when you realize just how much light you need and how really these lights aren't affecting the scene as much. So what I mean by you don't need as much negative black when I'm shooting film is that because you already need that little bit more light than you would, there's already a lot more contrast that you'd naturally get as opposed to when you're shooting on digital. So
Sure.
I do
Yeah.
use a lot of negative black, but I feel like sometimes just by having the lights, be quite directional, quite focused into the area that you need them to be in, it already creates quite a lot of contrast. And often or not, sometimes I would actually bounce a little bit of light into the shadows, knowing I can pull that back down if I want to in the grade, rather than
Do you
increasing
find
that
yourself
contrast.
shooting with harder light sources as opposed to softer light sources when you're shooting on film?
Yes and no. I guess again, it all depends on the scene. For these kind of music videos where I'm trying to get them to be quite poppy and rich and saturated, um, and having those contrast levels, super rich, super black, I would say that often or not, it is more directional. I think if I've got time to light, typically I would light with bigger sources from much further away that almost cover a much bigger area. So in terms of the blocking, it's not like an actor or an actress has to hit a certain mark. It's
Right.
not like if they don't hit that mark, I'm sitting there behind the camera going, shit, there's a big shadow here, or they haven't quite hit their mark. It shouldn't. Obviously, it is up to an actor, or an actress to hit marks and have that in the back of their mind in terms of the blocking. But I don't want their performance to be affected based on the fact that they need to hit an area of light. So sometimes there is a focused light, and I'd say for this scene, more often than not, it was more focused because the blocking was that they don't actually move from those positions. So typically, knowing that they wouldn't move much, I can focus the light in. But if I knew that they were going to move around, have a dance, move from one side to the other, typically I need to make sure the light is going to, extend to those areas, unless, you know, my brain is telling me, or my goal is that I'm happy to let them fall into the shadows. And I think that's the luxury of film, is that because, in my opinion, everything looks good, whether it's overexposed, underexposed, you can
Yeah.
have things out of focus, you can have it
Right.
literally to the point where it looks like the neg has broken down so much that you're only getting an artistic impression of an image. Um,
No, it's good. Film is definitely forgiving in ways, I think, like that.
Yeah. I think film is forgiving. And I think that's why there's a tendency to not worry about overlighting a scene. I think if someone falls into a shadow, or ends up in a slight more highlight, I think you can almost embrace it. It almost feels more real, because that's what would happen in real life. Not everyone looks perfect all the time in every corner of the room. So I think there is that tendency to sort of allow the action to have those moments where it's, not always in the spotlight. And I think I try to, not allow my lighting to put off a performance, or to distract any cast member. I don't want them to think about where they need to, what mark they need to hit, in order to look good. I want it to feel like, if they end up 2 foot to the left or 2 foot to the right, that's
Right.
absolutely fine. I've got an answer for
Yeah.
that. So
What do you think something that made this piece? Like without it, it wouldn't be what it is.
ultimately, I think the sort of Eastern European aesthetic is what makes this video. I think the idea that you don't quite know where we are, yet there are things that happen, whether it's the actions of the cast, the situations that they find themselves in, there feels like there's elements that you can relate to. But I would say without that aesthetic, if this was just set in a London nightclub with British looking people, with, probably what most people would consider typical sort of beauty models, if you like, I would say that the aesthetic and the feeling that you get from watching it would never be the same. I would say the fact that the cast is so unique, the fact that we had an interesting looking location that is a little bit dilapidated, is a little bit run down, is a little bit, you know, stuck in an era maybe 30, 40 years prior, has really interesting textures. I think that whole essence that the director wanted to create is what makes this video sort of stand out. It's what gives you that feeling of being able to connect, but also feeling like it's, you know, it could be I don't want to say semi-futuristic because it depicts nostalgia, but almost, you know, that you can't quite put your finger on where it is and and what year it is.
Yeah. Did something almost break it as a shoot, as a project?
There's obviously things that the director and I maybe on retrospect look like we could have or would have wanted to change or maybe do differently. I think when you're under that time constraint of such a quick turnaround, you know, not even be able to see the location ahead of time and almost having to have a lighting package that you know can be flexible, you know, dependent on, you know, I didn't know how tall the ceilings were, you know, I didn't know necessarily the power supply, you know, so we almost have to have a lot of different lights and a lot of different types of kit in order to be flexible. And knowing that I was going in there with an aesthetic that I wanted to create, I was going in there knowing roughly what the spaces looked like, how the light was going to reflect off them. But ultimately, I needed to have a few answers just in case there was any curveballs on the day. So I wouldn't say anything nearly broke the shoot, but I would say with more time in retrospect, not that it could have been fixed or improved, but yeah, maybe there might have been slightly different approaches to some of the scenes.
Like, holistically, what about a project makes you proud of it in the end? Like, when it's all said and done, is there like one thing with all your work that you look back and you know, that makes you proud of it?
It's funny because I was thinking about this earlier in the sense of being proud of your work. And I think, you know, setting up for this interview and digging out old behind the scenes, you know, footage and stills and, you know, going through my project folder of all the jobs I've done, I think then I sort of got a sense of being proud, you know. But I think so many of us, no matter what role that you know undertake, so many of us are shooting something within a few weeks, shooting the next thing, and I think it's very rare that we get time to sit there, analyze, appreciate, reflect on what maybe you would do differently. I think for me at least, which is probably, you know, a bit of a curse, I'm always chasing that next high. I'm always chasing that next challenge or that next big project. I very rarely settle. I very rarely feel settled. So I would say recently, over the last year or so, whereby I've been taking on less jobs in a month. I probably only do 1 to 2 jobs tops, I would say, in a month now. That's given me the ability not only to put more time into prep, but to also think about what's the best thing for a project. And also, it means then when I've shot it, I have a bit more time to sort of reflect on what went well. You know, what were the lenses like? You know, what was that lighting style like? You know, how could I improve that? Or it gives me the ability to analyze a little bit more. But I would say that's only a recent feeling. And I'd say being proud of my work is something that it's more of a retrospective feeling. It's not something that presently I'm sitting there thinking I done an amazing job. It's normally, like I said, film is so subjective that it's hard for me to say I've done a good job or not. You know, it's I feel like most of the time my gut tells me to take a project and I never really regret taking any project. I feel like I've always learned from a project. I feel like I've always had something to gain from a project. I always look at the positives, even if it is a disaster. You know, I try and look at the one scene that did come out right that I learned a lot from. So yeah, retrospectively, when I look back at what I've done, I am proud of my work, but there's a long, long way to go. And I think knowing where I want to be and how far that away that feels, I think it's hard for me to ever feel settled in and proud because I'm always looking for that next feeling.
Yeah.
Being proud for me is when I see people really vibing with what I'm making. I'm not a numbers person. I don't look at how many likes I've got or how many comments I've got. You know, that's a byproduct of whether people are vibing off of my stuff. But what's nice is seeing comments. What's nice is getting feedback and hearing, oh, I really like the way you lit this scene, or really like the way you shot this. It doesn't happen all the time, but it is always a really, really nice, reassuring feeling that what you're doing, is appealing to some people, even if I'm my biggest critic and I think, I really wish I did this and this. It's nice when others get something out of my work. It's it's a really, really nice, reassuring feeling that I'm on the right path at least.
Literally, like there's some filmmakers that would probably have your body of work and consider themselves as someone who's made it, who's accomplished a lot. Where are you wanting to go from here with your work, your career, what you make?
It's interesting. I would say, like, I'm a very ambitious person. I guess in the era we're in, getting to see all these amazing filmmakers, on a handful of platforms display their work, I'm constantly reminded of stuff that I want to work on. As a DOP, like, I very rarely take the same kind of project, and I very rarely take that, with massive gaps with other genres, and I try to fill up my calendar with as many varied projects as possible. But there's still a hell of a lot of stuff I really want to shoot. I'm incredibly grateful for what I've done in a sort of short space of time. And it's funny, when I first started out in this industry, someone said you can't call yourself a DP until you've got grey hair. So I've been constantly checking in the mirror to see when that time comes. But I think I see myself eventually going into more narrative. At the moment, I've shot a lot of different commercials in fashion, music, sport. I've been doing a lot of alcohol commercials recently. But for me, I've been trying to sort of steer my career more into taking narrative-based commercials. Um, Essentially, like, I love watching people get a kick out of stuff I've made, and that normally only happens if there's a story to tell or a feeling that has been evoked. And that's why the music videos that I tend to take on are more narrative driven, or at least create an essence like this Artemas one that makes you feel like you're someone else, you're somewhere else, or someone else for a short sort of period of time. For me, I would say that narrative is what I'm chasing in terms of commercials, and I'm quite happy being in short form at the moment. It's one of those things where I get to try new kit all the time. I get to work with new people all the time. I'm learning about different cultures, religions, genders, different mindsets, different ages, perspectives. And for me, if I was to work on longer projects, I maybe wouldn't have that ability to constantly, learn and be up to date with all the latest technology.
Yeah, I mean, talk about versatility. I feel that when I look at your work. We spent a good bit of time breaking down this super gritty music video, but you've also got a good bit of fashion work under your belt. Like Gucci, Raisa Vanessa, H&M, Casablanca. How is shooting for fashion different?
Fashion is different in a lot of ways. It was an industry where I didn't know how to get into. I didn't have, loads of fashion orientated friends. Not that they didn't dress well, but they didn't necessarily go to runways and,
Right.
hang out at fashion events. So it felt like quite a hard nut to crack in that sense. It all started because I did a music video in a director's house, and it wasn't the director that was directing this music video, but he owned this fashion house. Every room was uniquely interior designed by his wife. Um, and the director's name was Tom Dream, and I met him through hiring his location. From that, I offered, if you need any, a DOP, I'm there and I'd love to shoot for you. I was fully aware of his work before sort of working in his house. And it all started because me, him, and a musician called Arlo Parks, who's huge now. But at the time, she didn't have a huge following. She wasn't the superstar that she is now. But the three of us basically shot a really nice, intimate project in Richmond Park in West London. And from that, Gucci saw that film, and Gucci asked Arlo to direct a film for Gucci with Tom, essentially, having the luxury of having the creative as quite a broad, sort of brief. They could sort of make what they want. And Tom, as a result of me helping him out on this sort of low-key intimate project, brought me along. And this is the first, as far as I'm aware, the first fashion project that both of us had worked on. So, you know, I hadn't shot for, you know, a small clothing brand at all before I shot for Gucci. This was the first ever sort of shoot I did. But what was really nice about it was that it didn't, because it was almost Gucci asking Arlo to make a film, it wasn't your typical Gucci film where you have, you know, 10, 15 clients around a monitor and, you know, it has to be like this and this. You know, we had the luxury of making what we wanted. We got sent loads of clothes, we proposed the ideas, and then we were allowed to make the film that we eventually made. From that, it snowballed. That one Gucci film got me the North Face Gucci campaign. With the first version, so I shot that, and then I got a massive run of jobs, like you said, Dolce & Gabbana, Gucci, Casablanca, H&M, Tommy Hilfiger. How does it differ? It differs because you're working with models, first and foremost, who are super professional. They're used to being in front of cameras. They're punctual, which is nice a lot of the time, you know, whereas artists, I've had it where they've turned up 5 hours late. I've had it where they haven't turned up at all.
Yeah.
So fashion for me is the perfect spot between music video and commercial. I work with a lot of commercial directors and clients whereby, you know, you have to light a certain color blue, otherwise it could not look like their brand, you know, or you have to frame things in a certain way because that's the typical way that they frame their commercials. Whereas with fashion, it feels that beautiful fine line between music videos and commercials whereby you have the experimental nature of a music video. You're able to do stuff like low shutter and you know, put it on a Moco, on a motion control, or you know, do all these creative and amazing things, but you have the budgets most of the time of commercials or closer to a commercial budget. So whereby music videos are super experimental, you don't always have the budget to sort of back the wackiness of ideas that some people have. Fashion enables you to sort of, almost get away with those ideas creatively, but also having the money to be able to achieve them. Whereas commercials by nature can be quite prescribed, quite difficult to break away from what a client wants. It becomes the idea you have to fight for what you want a lot more. And I've seen it where directors haven't had the luxury of getting what they want, you know, and it's sometimes strange when they've been flown across the world because of their portfolio to suddenly not get to make what they want. So fashion's a really, really nice place to be in, and I'm really grateful for all the jobs I've been able to do.
I mean, what do you think about spec work, you know, and this notion that you have to create it first before people will hire you for it?
Yeah, it is a hard thing in our industry. There's a lot of stumbling blocks that you can hit that feel like a sort of chicken and an egg. You almost need one to get the other. Spec commercials, I think, can be a brilliant way to, especially for DOPs and directors. I think they're amazing as a means to create something that you wouldn't necessarily get hired to do. I've done it for directors before, whereby, you know, we might have shot certain projects in that genre, but they might not necessarily have shot the style in which they want to sort of lead their work with. So for me, like, getting to shoot something exactly the way me and a director want for a brand that, you know, might not necessarily even dip into that kind of stylistic territory, I think is a really unique sort of thing to be able to do. Obviously, it does mean that you're mostly self-funding these projects, but I've had it, you know, pay off in dividends, in the sense of, you know, I did a perfume ad that was a spec commercial, and I remember wanting to do it really dark. I wanted to shoot it on film. I hadn't seen or shot a perfume ad that was on film. Most of the time it's clean, you know, very beauty led. So I wanted to do something quite dark. And that was the first time I ended up using our Scorpion Wrangler, you know. So it was interesting to be able to do something completely my style without having anyone tell me that it's the wrong thing to do, or, you know, you can't do this because of X. So I think then you can, you know, use that spec commercial. Sometimes, obviously, I've seen it where brands have bought that commercial and it becomes an official commercial for that brand or product. But 9 times out of 10, the ability to have that, even if it's for internal use, the ability to be able to go, you know, we should take this perfume commercial down this route, and this is the reason why. Like this is, you know, this is a successful way of doing that. And then I think once you sell that idea, once you get one or two jobs being able to do things in your style as a director or a DP, it's much easier to convince the sort of next people that you work with.
Us being frame set, I'm always asking directors about how they shape their treatments and pitch decks. But you as a DP, you know, how do you interact with a treatment for any given project?
I'm brought on at all different stages. Sometimes I'm brought on in the pitching stage, which I find incredibly useful, because I couldn't tell you the amount of times that someone has come to me being like, I have an idea, this is it. And I'm like, cool, I know how to achieve that. But then you see the budget and you think this is unrealistic. You know, there's obviously most of the time I would say there's more than one way to achieve something. You know, there's not only one camera that can achieve the same thing. There's not only one set of lenses that can achieve the same thing. Like there's always variation, right, to achieve the same goal. But I would say that being brought in that pitching stage means I can be like, this is the best, most efficient way to do it. I've already done this, so this is how it's done. This is, you know, how much it roughly costs, or at least we can go to a producer and say, this is, you know, how much does this cost? And it means then it's all factored into the early pitch, the early budgets, which means then if and when that person does win the treatment, you know that A, you can achieve it, B, you've already discussed it, you know how you're going to go about doing it, but you know it's realistic to what they're working with. So that I find incredibly useful. But as a DOP reading treatments, it's similar to reading scripts. A lot of it is a gut feeling. A lot of it for me, I take projects based on what I haven't done previously. I look at stuff that maybe is a challenge. I look at things that can broaden my portfolio. It's very easy, I think, as a DOP to be stuck in just music videos or just, you know, a particular genre of commercial. That for me, I've always wanted to be as broad as possible. It's funny because it's like when you ask a DP or you say to a DP, you know, your style is like this and this, whereas I don't see my style as that. And most DOPs will say to you that, you know, every project is a blank canvas at which to apply new tools and new techniques. And you almost want, you know, each project to have a sort of unique identity. However, it's similar in a way, you know, you have to listen to your gut. You read a script and it doesn't necessarily turn out the way you want it to. And it's all testament, I think, a project success to the team that's around it and the timing of it. Sometimes it's about, you know, getting the right song at the right time for an artist, or coming out with you're reading a brief and you're thinking, this is perfect for where we're at. You know, it's the right amount of, I don't know, political satire for today's times, or it's the right amount of avant-gardeness. You know, it's one of those where like you have to weigh each one up. Yeah, I think briefs for me, I have to read it, I have to feel something, I have to read that brief or script and think I can really add something to this, I can really put my personality on this. And I have to be getting ideas immediately. If I was to read a script and I'm not thinking about it visually, there's probably a reason for it, that I'm not necessarily connecting with it as much.
Yeah, you mentioned working with a variety of people. I want to just double click on that for a minute. You know, I think the way that directors collaborate with people and the way that the DP collaborates with people, I think are very different. You know, I think the DP, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the DP is a little more crew facing than the director is. Talk about what it's like to work with crew and wrangle all these very talented people to make one image.
I got into this industry a bit differently. Obviously, most people, and I say that broadly, would take those kind of traditional steps of working as a camera assistant or as a spark, and they would work their way up the ladder in that sense. For me, I graduated, I came straight out of university just shooting, just constantly shooting. And it could have been projects that I didn't really want to be a part of, but I just did it to keep busy, and other projects that I knew that I'd one scene from that project would be adding it to my reel and would, you know, essentially get me that next bigger thing. So for that reason, it means that my learning has been from surrounding myself with crew that know far more than me. I'm not going to say to my AC, this is the best way to do it, because it won't be, you know, and I'd be an idiot to think that. So the way I would communicate with my crew is just almost empowering them, you know, getting the best out of them, making sure that the best way to have their support is by giving them responsibility, is by making them feel like they're a part of it as much as I am.
Yeah.
I think there's a tendency to wanting to go into a project feeling super confident, almost, you know, having every area covered. But I think ultimately your team are there to back you up. Your team are there to have your back. And I think the more you can sort of empower them, the more you can sort of give them responsibility to make them feel like they're collaborating with you as much as you are collaborating with the rest of the HODs. I think that's the single most important thing you can do. I think you get into dangerous territory when you become a bit like a dictator, almost saying, I want that light on that stand over there at this height. It becomes, you know, really prescripted. People will check out really quickly. I think the ability to work with is always better than working against. And for me, that's what I try to do with the crew. I know that they're going to be experienced enough. I know that they're there for a reason and that they've earned their way to the set that we're on. We're all there, you know, not by chance. So for me, it's that I sort of just allow them a voice, empowering that voice, and getting the best out of them that I can, no matter where I'm working and what country I'm in.
You've worked in a lot of countries. I know a lot of filmmakers who have a fine body of work who have never left the United States. Give me some perspective on what it's like to work internationally in the way that you have.
Working at the country is really interesting. It's obviously an amazing experience to be able to sort of dip your toe in a different culture and a different group of people for a short space of time. But I love shooting out of the country. When I first started doing commercials out the country, it was quite terrifying. You know, I think you're so used to working with, you know, 2 or 3 sort of people that you rotate between in each crew role, and it's almost your safety net. It's your comfort zone of, you know, knowing that you can turn up on set. You don't have to question anyone's ability. You don't have to worry about crew in a sense. And obviously from a communication standpoint, if something isn't quite right, you can communicate really easily. Whereas when you work outside the country, I've had it where, you know, it's a lot of broken down English, or sometimes they don't speak English at all. Sometimes I'm talking to the spark that has to communicate to the gaffer, or, you know, or a runner might have to just be by my side and almost be my translator. It's one of those things where each situation is super unique, but there's a beauty in it. There's something, again, to be sort of gained in terms of learning from different people. You know, you don't always have the luxury of the latest equipment, or sometimes they have, you know, more up-to-date equipment than what you're using in London. So
Yeah, I mean, you know what it's like to walk on a set and know almost no one around you, you
yeah,
know? So how do you garner that type of unity when you don't really know anyone?
yeah. I think it sort of stems from the amount of planning I do means that I know a project so well, to the point where I will often collaborate on storyboards with a director. I often pitch on that project with a director. I'm there from such an infant stage, and I would say I've maybe missed about 5 to 10 grades in the last 10 years. I normally sit in every single grade session. Most of the time it's unpaid. But for me, I see a project right through. If I always say to people, if you've got me on a project, it's not that I'm just going to sort of turn up on the day and dip after that. It's going to be a case where, you know, if anything, I'm going to give you homework, and I'm going to be asking you more questions than you're going to ask me. Like, that's how it
Yeah.
feels. And for me, after doing that much prep, I've always walked onto set feeling quite confident.
Yeah.
When I started shooting commercials, I was young. I was like early 20s. And
Hmm.
for an early 20-year-old to travel internationally, sometimes my gaffers would be in their 50s and 60s. You know, I would be the
Yeah.
youngest person in that team. And I think
Yeah.
for them to get to sort of my trust and vice versa, that comes from me being able to do my job and at a high level. And that only happens if I put the time into the prep. and know that when I walk on set, I've got an answer for everything. I'm not going to sit there twiddling my thumbs. And I think that, or I like to hope that that confidence rubs off on my team.
Yeah, I mean, that's the word, isn't it? Confidence. And I mean, because let's face it, there are infinite possibilities on the day. You know, whether it's choosing a lens, a collaborator, whether or not to take a job, where to, how to position your blocking, you know what I mean? And how do you think you get that confidence in order to make those right decisions when there are infinite possibilities?
I would say, again, a lot of it's understanding what the director wants to say with the project that they're trying to make. I think it's understanding the tone, the personality, the message, the feeling that you want the audience to get from it. A lot of it is down to experience. I've put myself in a lot of situations that I've very rarely slept the night before, where I'm thinking, oh my God, this is a big deal for me. This is either the biggest commercial I've shot, or this is the biggest artist I've worked with, or, so I've had a lot of situations where I'm out of my comfort zone, and I almost thrive off of it. I almost overplan to the point where I make sure that I'm not going to fail. Like I said, not every project turns out the way you want, but there's always something to learn from it. And I think the experiences I've had working with all different types of crew, different ages, genders, races, religions, all across Europe and across the world, I think has just given me different nuances of how different people like to work.
That's amazing that you have that. And I think it's especially important when shit hits the fan, when something on set happens that's unexpected, and then you need to decide where to go from there. And I think if you've done your prep, you know where to go from there, and you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah. And there's also, there's a couple of directors I have that put a lot of time into the prep, and then on the day they still change their mind,
Yeah. I feel like you've done enough work in your life. You're confident enough with your abilities. But what's something that you think you're not good at? What's something that you need to work harder at, to strive for, to help you with what your goals are?
One I would say is sometimes not being patient enough when you're waiting for a right project to come in. I think when I first started, I was saying yes to every project. I was just trying to get as much experience as I can. I was trying to meet as many people as I could. But I would say, especially when I got to a point where I was offered, more jobs per week, and I knew that I couldn't say yes to everything anymore, that I would say sometimes being patient and waiting for something you're super passionate about was maybe a weakness of mine. And I would say the biggest weakness away from film is allowing time for yourself. I think it's so easy to get in a rut where you're just constantly shooting, constantly working. Obviously, as you know, the hours are super long. It's not for the faint-hearted. You almost have to love your job. Otherwise, it probably would feel like a burden. It's never felt like a burden to me. So much of, obviously, they say art imitates life in a sense, right? So it's one of those where you almost need to live life. You need to have those down days. You need to be able to fill your brain with holidays and watching films and reading books and almost doing that in order to sort of think of new things, think of different ways to approach, films, and also just get that balance back in yourself. I think for me, one of my biggest weaknesses was overworking, not allowing enough time in between projects to maybe rethink of a new approach. I would say that quite a few years ago, I was shooting so many things in a month, and you don't have the space in between to think, is this the best approach for this project? So I would maybe rely on comfortable lenses that I've used before, where I know what the close focus is. I know, if they breathe or not. I know what level of distortion they have. Not that they weren't nice for the project, and no one would maybe be, looking, thinking they were the wrong lenses. But I would say that having more time in between shoots really enables me now to think, is this the best thing for the job? Is this the best approach? So yeah, I would say having balance in your life, making sure that you're, seeing friends, hearing about experiences, watching stuff, filling your mind with inspiration. I think if you don't do that, you can fall into the trap of relying on techniques and relying on kit that you feel comfortable using, that you know will work for a particular project, but maybe you could have pushed the boat a little bit more. Maybe you could have, rented out a different set and tested them. Maybe you could have tried a different lighting technique or setup. And I think for me now, that's what I strive to sort of do better at, is allowing enough time in between projects, but also, making sure that myself isn't suffering or my personal life isn't suffering. I think it's super important, and it's hard to sort of lose sight of.
Well, Luke, I end the podcast with the same question every time. And that question is, what haven't I asked you? What do I not know how to... The ball's in your court here. What do you have to tell me?
I mean, that's a broad question. I hope that any young filmmaker watching this, just keeps at it, never stop sort of believing, put 100% into everything. It's not something that I feel like you can do half-heartedly. If you really want to make waves in this industry, if you really want to make a stamp, if you really want to put your identity or your unique approach on something, you need to work really hard at it. And maybe don't be fazed by anyone telling you that something's right or wrong, because it's so subjective. What you like, a million other people could like. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean it's wrong. And I think just believe in your ideas and run away with them.
Sage advice from Luke Harper. Thanks so much, man. I appreciate you.
No worries at all. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dylan.